Okay, welcome everyone. Happy to have everybody. Thank you for joining us on your Saturday morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. We're going to go ahead and get started. I see people still coming in, but we're going to go ahead and get started. We are so excited to welcome Elizabeth Einen-Kokerda today. She's going to be with us speaking on compensatory education. Elizabeth focuses her practice on education issues and is an education attorney for over 20 years. She has served as the chair of the National Council of School Attorneys and president of the Nebraska Council of School Attorneys. In addition to her private practice, she currently serves as managing attorney for the Education Rights Council, a nonprofit advocating for the special education and due process rights of children and families. Elizabeth's exhaustive legislative experience has developed her passion for working to improve education laws at the state and federal level. Elizabeth is licensed to practice in Nebraska, Iowa, and before the United States Supreme Court. So welcome, Elizabeth. We are excited to have you here today, and we're going to turn the presentation over to you.
Thank you, Paige, and thank you, everybody. I know it's a Saturday. We have a lot going on our plates, but I'm really excited just to be able to share some of this background. And when Paige asked me if I would talk specifically towards compensatory ed and what we do to recover in the best ways possible as families due to the negative impact the pandemic has had on our children's learning, I was really excited to join. So let's get started. As Paige said, I'm Elizabeth Einen-Kokerda, and I am here today in my role as managing attorney for Education Rights Council, which, as Paige said, is a nonprofit that advocates for educational equity. And what we really try to do is amplify the voices of our most vulnerable children, and we do it by education. So we really want families to be great advocates. We also do it by working with groups such as your particular organization and organizations both at the state and national level to assure that they have a sounding board that they can come to. And we also really work with attorneys, and we try to educate and provide free CLE, continuing legal education, so that we're growing the body of advocates that are available to serve families. That's enough on my organization. So
Elizabeth, sorry to interrupt you, but I did realize I forgot a little housekeeping. We did turn off the chat function, but if you have a question anytime during this presentation, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A and we will answer those as we go. Thanks.
And one other thing, Paige, I would say is if you have questions and you don't think about them till the end, we are reserving Q&A time for the end where we can kind of do an open conversation. And also if there are questions that we don't get to because we run long or you just didn't get yours answered, I would encourage you to reach out to your organization, reach out to Paige, send her those questions, and then I can kind of do a consolidated answer, which can be distributed to you as needs be. So if you're one of those shy types that really doesn't want to ask your question right now, that's fine too. All right, so what are we going to talk about? First, we're going to give you a little background. Then we're going to talk about basically three things that I was asked to focus on, which is it's all of a piece, which is what do we do? How do we get services back? How do we handle this? Which we're going to talk about compensatory services. We're going to talk about recovery services. What's the difference? How do you go about getting them? We're going to talk about extended year services. What are they? What aren't they? Can you have 1, 2, 3 more? What can happen? And then we're going to do like a refresher about getting your best IEP. I don't know the level of facilitation that each of you may have. I know that all of you clearly have been through IEPs. Some have maybe more sophistication or less. So I'm going to give that refresher. And then again, in Q&A, I'm happy to answer maybe more complex questions. At the end, I will try to wrap it all together, telling you, saying, okay, here's what we learned about comp ed, et cetera. Here's what we learned about IEPs. Now, how do we go out and get what we need? Great. So what happened as the pandemic set in? I think y'all know this, all right? School districts were and are still required to provide FAPE. School districts did not have and do not have a right to unilaterally change your IEP without your meaningful consent and participation and or due process. So they don't get to say, well, there was a pandemic, so we changed the IEP and you don't get those services that you were supposed to get. All timelines created by IDEA, so those would be things like Oh, how long does somebody have if I ask for an MDT to give it? How long do I have to have my child verified? When do I have to have a new IEP? It's not an excuse that just because we had a pandemic that we can delay at least the annual review of IEPs. So in effect, statutorily, legally, nothing changed, but everything changed, right? I mean, so many children lost so much. Timelines weren't complied with. Services weren't offered. IEPs weren't followed, or the services provided by the school district remotely, however they went about doing it, didn't work because your child wasn't able to truly access them. I think that's one of the biggest challenges we saw, and that's why we're going to talk about recovery services. We saw schools maybe doing their darndest to get services out, but they're trying to teach children who actually need hands-on, one-on-one individual support through a box. It didn't work. So where are we now, and what are we going to do about it? We're going to start at the beginning, which is FAPE. FAPE has not changed. What is FAPE? A free, appropriate public education. It is the core essence of what IDEA requires. And the way we decide whether you got FAPE or not is whether you had an IEP that's, quote, reasonably calculated to enable your child to make progress appropriate in light of your child's circumstances. That is the Andrew F. standard that was set in 2017 by the Supreme Court. Prior to that, we kind of had a panoply of approaches by Eighth Circuit, other circuits. I'm in the Eighth Circuit, but so in the Eighth Circuit, we had basically a minimal effort standard. It was not a good standard. That changed because of Andrew F. These are great words, but like, what do they mean? We're going to talk about that a little bit more. First of all, we want to talk about progress today. And that's because what happened during the pandemic? Lack of progress. So, while we know that when a child isn't fully integrated, the IEP doesn't have to aim for grade level advancement, progress is still essential. And what you get provided has to be, quote, appropriately ambitious. So applying that to the pandemic, for example, we can't say that, well, nobody really got much, so your child didn't need to make progress on the goals that we already set, because that's not appropriately ambitious. So this standard of appropriately ambitious still stands. And we need to know that every child should have had an occasion to meet those challenging objectives. So I know that school districts do not like the words dumbing down, and I don't mean it in an insulting manner, but we don't dumb down what we expect of children just because of the pandemic. Instead, we stand up, we rise up, we meet the challenge. Okay, so what is the traditional way of going about when FAPE isn't applied? So I'm sure many of you have, at least, I don't know how many of you have ever gone through due process, but you've probably at least heard the words. And so the traditional remedy for a denial of FAPE, and the denial of FAPE can come a couple different ways. One way is you simply didn't provide services. Another denial of FAPE is your IEP is terrible. It just doesn't do what you need to do. A third way of denial of FAPE is, you know what, the IEP is okay, but you didn't actually get enough services to meet your goal. So in other words, if we say my son Bill is going to progress on whatever scale, and we're going to talk about measurable objectives, and they're going to go from point A to point B, and we think that's a reasonable goal. And what happened is my son didn't even make progress or made minimal progress towards that goal. That's usually indicia that I didn't get services. So enough services. Maybe I needed 2 hours of X rather than a half hour of X. So the traditional way of going about getting that remedy is either informally or formally through due process, requiring compensatory ed. So what are compensatory ed services? They're things that make up for what you didn't get. In the COVID frame of mind, the key question for compensatory ed is, did the school actually provide or make an effort to provide, or didn't they even try? So we had some schools that said, we can't do speech language. You just don't get it during the pandemic. Sorry. That would be indicia that compensatory ed is owed. Okay. Now, compensatory ed, this is the only word we had before the pandemic. Compensatory ed is not expressly defined in IDEA, but it's a court remedy. It's an equitable remedy. Equitable means fairsies, okay? So there's different kinds of remedies at law, and equitable remedy says you have to make up for what you didn't do. And the makeup is not necessarily minute for minute. So let's say your IEP said that your child is supposed to get 30 minutes of speech 3 times a week. And for the last quarter of last year, you got 0. One way to go about remedying that is add up those 30 minutes times the number of school days and say, okay, we owe you 250 minutes of speech. However, that's not how compensatory ed has generally been looked at in the law. The law says compensatory ed is to put your child in the place where they should have been. I'll be repeating this a couple of times, but the idea is that what we want to do is say, okay, if my child had had that speech at the end of the year, looking at his goals, this is where he should have been. Now, we're not going to go back and say, okay, but he wasn't, so we're going to back those goals down and then just move forward, because then your child lost what? Everything. They lost the 4th quarter. So compensatory ed is on top of the ongoing services. So you come back and you're getting your speech again, everything's hunky-dunky, except that you lost these minutes. It's not good enough just to say, well, add the minutes necessarily, if that's not going to get your child where they should have been. So it can be minute for minute if you agree to that, but it also can be, no, we're going to keep on going until we think we have actually met that conceptual goals progress rather than just a minute per minute replacement. Okay. Now, we're going to also talk about recovery services. Okay. Recovery services are this new concept that schools are running to. And it's because compensatory ed is generally considered a mistake. The school district screwed up. Here, and I'm going to move the slide, I think, yep, the new word post-pandemic recovery services is sort of a no-fault alternative. It's also slightly different than compensatory ed because it can apply to students who are in the gen ed world as well as students who are in the special education realm. Okay, something happened. I think I just got spotlighted. I don't know what that means, but I'm going to keep right on going. So what I wanted to say about recovery services is they're sort of to mitigate the regression and gaps your child suffered, even if the services were allegedly provided. So going back to what I said at the beginning, where your school may have made a yeoman's effort to deliver those services, they got online, they did what they could, but literally your child just couldn't follow along. Your child isn't able to stay focused on a little box. Your child may not have the physical capacity to click. Your child may get distracted readily, and so seeing multiple faces doesn't work. Your child may have needed a para to help access, and while the speech person was there was no para to help, and so your child just wasn't able to continue. That's where recovery comes in. And nearly every state in the United States and every school district, so state departments of education and school districts are now engaging in the construct of saying, okay, we acknowledge it was the pandemic, it wasn't our fault, but we see there are gaps. We know people lost stuff, so we've got to engage in a recovery analysis. So first we have compensatory ed, new word, recovery services. Let's go on and take a look at that a little bit more. If I could get my thing to click. There we go. Oh, this is an important point. Compensatory ed, once in a while, you can go and you can tell your district, hey, you know you owe me, and we can either go to due process or we can skip that and just let's compensate. And some districts will say okay, and some districts will not. So it's not necessarily an IEP team decision unless the school district chooses to make it. And often even then it's not, it's maybe a district level decision. So your head of special education services might say, yep, there's compensatory ed and we're just going to go about giving it to you. And we're going to create a plan, but it's not necessarily an IEP team decision. Whereas recovery services are an IEP team decision. And the decision basically goes through 3 questions. Did your child experience some regression? Or was there progress? And if so, was it enough? And was there an inability to engage in what was offered? Okay. Answering those questions lead you to whether there should be recovery services. Now, I know that every state, and I don't know which states you may be in right now, every state has opened up at different rates. And so have different school districts within each state. But what your goal is your goal is to have recovery discussion before your child, returns to bricks and mortar. But if you're already there, no harm, no foul. You all know that you can call an IEP team meeting and request one at any time. And generally they should give it to you. If they don't, they give you prior written notice, then you're in the due process cycle. But most school districts are being pushed by their state departments of education to offer IEP teams specifically to discuss recovery services. I want to note that just like compensatory ed, recovery can be accomplished multiple ways. So compensatory ed could be accomplished by increasing services in your IEP during your regular school day. So we just add on another 15 minutes every day of such and such. Sometimes that's not a good solution though, because there's only so many hours. And as soon as we add on 15 minutes for my child for speech, my child lost 15 minutes of something else. If it's in the school day, they lost reading, they lost math. So picking and choosing, those are very, very individual decisions that each family has to make with the team. But remember, both compensatory ed and recovery services can be outside the regular day. Okay, so they can be after school, before school. They can be during school breaks. They can be on weekends. They can be over the summer. Anytime you are ready and they have services and you can agree upon what they're going to be provided, that's your world. So if there's 24 hours in the day, that's your world. It's not appropriate for somebody to say, well, we only offer X during Y. A lot of school districts do that because they have limited number of employees. Nonetheless, under the law, they're not allowed to say, well, we only offer 3 days of X a summer. That's a no-no in my world as a lawyer, and so therefore in my world representing people like you. Y'all are key. Now, this is an empowering thing to think about. The reason you're more key is y'all have walked into those IEP meetings. You sit down, maybe you're fortunate to have a significant other or somebody assisting you at the table, or you're all alone, and there are what? 9 other people, all from the school district, all speaking schoolese at you. And it's intimidating because they're all going, And if you have questions, you may be afraid to ask them, or you may think that you don't know what you should in order to be informed. I'm going to try and help you with that. But here you've got a little bit of power. And why do you have power? Because you were largely the sole provider for the education of your child during the pandemic. In other words, you were there too, right? We were all sitting in front of our Zoom with our child right beside us, trying to do work, trying to assist our child. We stepped in. And what that gives us is much more important information with regard to progress, with regard to access. We know what our child was doing. We know if our child was laying down on the couch or crawling under the couch rather than participating in class. We know whether our child was clicked out or couldn't get in. We know whether our child even was able to get was delivered what they were supposed to get in terms of, workbooks or an iPad. So you have that power, and you hopefully have been able to document what you can. Or if you didn't document during like the pandemic, and well, we're still in the pandemic, but during outside school and now your kid's back in the bricks and mortar environment, you can still go back and look at your old progress notes. Where was your child pre-pandemic? What was your child doing in February of 2020? How did that look? What's your child doing now? You know that. And so you have maybe more authority at the table because you've got the data and the district doesn't have it. and they need to take it into account more seriously. So what should you be talking about with your school? All right, like I said, first of all, look at the data. You're trying to figure out, should I be going and asking for recovery or comp ed? How do I do it? You look at your data. You look at how your child was doing pre-COVID. You're looking at their learning. You look at the regression rate they had, because remember, COVID may have had additional negative impacts on all of us, and especially our children who are more vulnerable. So really doing an honest look-see is the start. And then look at the progress based on progress notes. Honestly, try and figure out what your child got and didn't get. And then if you see something, say something. Do not be afraid to call and ask for an IEP team meeting. If your district hasn't reached out to you already, which many districts are reaching out directly, others are swamped. So what I've seen some districts doing is, that the end of the year is, everybody's trying to get everything done because school is going to close and teachers are going to leave, and it's sort of a madhouse. They're doing a lot of reach out, and just basically doing an assessment. And some school districts have asked their special ed team to go and do the assessment, even, internally, and then reach out to the parent to see if the parent agrees, and just automatically offering it. Other districts are just sitting tight. It's because they're probably overwhelmed. Squeaky wheel gets the grease. There's nothing wrong with you being a squeaky wheel. Ask for an IEP team. And then if the district does determine that recovery services are appropriate based on your data, what you're seeing, and sometimes districts will try and merge comp ed and recovery. From my perspective, I honestly don't care what anybody calls it, as long as you get what you need. Okay, so dying on the hill of, well, no, this is compensatory ed and this is recovery. I don't care if it's going to give you the additional services that are appropriate to get your child, to close that gap your child suffered while the pandemic was ongoing. I think one question people raise is, well, if the district says, well, everybody lost during the pandemic, so your child is just in the place as every other general ed kid, so we really don't owe anything. In my world, that's a big nope, you're wrong. And you're wrong because, as I started out, IDEA didn't change. IDEA said I still get free appropriate public education, and that means I get what my IEP said I should get. And if the pandemic made it impossible for my child to get what the IEP said I would get, whether you tried it or not, recovery is still appropriate under IDEA. So what should an IEP team do, assuming they're gonna come together, right? You can encourage this if your district isn't fluent in recoveryese. So just like I said, you should be looking, they should be looking. So what they should be doing is they should be going back. And when you have this IEP team meeting, you should expect that they have reviewed past IEP goals and progress, that they've gathered additional data right now from what they're seeing from teachers. They should have any screening or assessment information, and they should have pre-tests and post-test data. So let's say your child is back. You've been at school for how long? Long time now, and you still see that there's a problem. You still have recovery services. Most school districts, understanding that there are only so many school hours in the day, so you can only, you can't ask a 6-year-old to start school at 5 p.m. and end at 9 p.m. They don't have that verticality. So we're looking at a horizontal approach to adding on hours. Most school districts are like thinking, okay, we can take this for a year out. So you haven't missed out just because it's been a couple months and your kid's back in school. Recovery is still appropriate right now based on what should have happened. And I'm arguing that there's a 2-year window. And the reason I'm taking that stance is because for those of you that may be familiar with due process, there is basically an internal statute of limitations in IDEA that says you have 2 years from the time you knew or should have known that your child wasn't receiving FAPE to file a due process complaint. I'm applying that same standard with regard to FAPE to the concept of recovery. So therefore, it's not too late yet if you haven't made that ask. Okay, We've talked about what the IEP team should gather, which is pre-COVID, and then of course, post-COVID. Post-COVID observations, samples of students' work, and if you have samples of what your child was doing while they were at home and now what they're doing. So pre-COVID, during COVID, after COVID, in terms of, again, COVID's not over, but we're talking with regard to attendance at school. Behavior logs, behavior could be a really, really big thing. And it may be COVID stress. So school districts are being encouraged to take a look and make sure we haven't seen additional needs arising. Don't be afraid of pushing for that if you've seen it. And so the last thing, it's last but certainly not least, is parents' interviews and observations. The IEP team definitely should be asking you for everything you've got and go ahead and give it to them. Remember that under an IEP, one of the things that will immediately arise to what's called a substantive violation of IDEA is lack of meaningful parental participation. So school districts have to show that you had a meaningful opportunity. So meaningful means you participate, you listen, and that there are no decisions made prior to all of your input being taken into account. So when is recovery appropriate? When additional services to recoup previous learning skills are indicated, or new services and supports that weren't previously provided are indicated basically to re-enter successfully. So this is where the whole mental health or services to address significant disengagement. We have so many children, I'm calling them sort of our lost children. They've disappeared, and school districts have done some crazy stuff. I hope this has not happened to any of you. Probably not, because you're involved parents, but many students just disappeared, and school districts, and I mean, I don't want anybody to be reported as truant, but they didn't want to do that. So they just didn't pursue it. And so we have children, I literally am working with children who have not gone to school for over a year. They just fell off the map, and the parents just dealt, and the school didn't do a dang thing. So recovery services should be unique, individualized to the student, and determined by AAP. Again, sky's the limit. It's what your child needs. And I want to make a point of it. While I've talked about looking at your goals and looking at your progress notes, that's just one area to consider when addressing the impact of the pandemic. So you look not only overall at what services your child did and didn't receive, but also at your child's attendance, engagement, attention, behavior, progress, home experiences, and progress in the gen ed curriculum. In other words, everything else your child is doing, not just the IEP goals. Even if your child is in a modified curriculum, when I say gen ed curriculum, I'm just saying everything your child's learning outside of those 6 goals that you may have set that have measurable objectives. And last but not least, recovery services don't change LRE requirements. So in other words, we want recovery. It's up to you and what fits your child best, but recovery can't look, if it doesn't fit your child's needs, like, okay, we'll take Bill and we'll put him in this little room by himself and, force feed him recovery services. Okay. Comp Ed and recovery services are not ESY. So what is ESY? ESY is meant to be prospective, and it is about regression and whether your child is at a particular point. Now, here's how they work together. Generally speaking, just because a child is behind their gen ed peers doesn't mean they get ESY. You get ESY if your child either has a likelihood of taking a much longer time to recovery from regression than a general ed peer. And the way you measure that is you look at what they are doing pre and what they are doing after they come back, summer breaks, etc. So there's data that should be gathered. Also, another area is if your child is on the cusp of making a particular progress. So let's say your child was out for a while and your child has behavior needs. And so your child had to get back into the swing of it. And your child's only been back 2 months. It took a long time, but he's just back into the swing of it. And he likely has transition issues. He probably wants very standardized schedule, wants to know predictability. That's a really good sign that ESY is due. And it might be particularly due because of the disruption that COVID caused. So in other words, the very impact of COVID itself, because it was disruptive, may engender a different way of looking at ESY. That being said, we have comp ed, and for simple purposes, comp ed, they didn't give me a service that said I get 30 minutes of X, I didn't get it. Recovery, they might have tried, I couldn't access it, or what we tried to access just didn't work and my child had issues. ESY, my child is on the cusp of something good, or my child is very likely to lose much more and take a lot longer time to get it back if I just go for a long period of time. I'm hoping these three things are clear. I'll take questions on them if you have specific questions, and I'm going to go a little bit more over it. So more on ESY versus comp ed and recovery. Okay. So could you have one? Could you have two? Could you have all three? The answer is yeah. Let's talk about that a little. For COVID compensatory services, the team could meet and determine to provide special education and related services over any of these times, okay? And that would be on top of what your child is getting in their IEP, and it's specifically to make up for a denial of FAPE, which is they didn't actually provide the service. And this is only, I'm just keeping this in simple COVID life terms. Comp ed is also available in other situations as we discussed at the beginning. But for now, that would be your comp ed question. All right. You could also be eligible for recovery services, which is not only didn't you get your 30 minutes of speech, but there was a lot of trauma for your child just getting dysregulated because things didn't work. And so we need some recovery services to help your child get back in the swing. Okay, so we could have some comp ed and we could have some recovery. In addition, your child could be at that cusp or at risk of regression. So you literally could have all three, and all three can be provided basically at any time that works. Now, you're saying to yourself, that's a lot, right? And it is, and a lot of districts are just gonna mush it in a ball. Like I said, from my particular perspective, what I always do is put the student front and center. So if I am going to get the student what the student needs, I don't really care what they call it. I just want it in the IEP, and I want it written, and I want to be able to hold people accountable for it. So if we're going to have recovery services that are addressing signs of regression, gaps in learning, we're going to talk about that. We're going to put that in the parental concerns part of the IEP. We'll be talking about that IEP in a minute. And then we're going to be seeking specific services to address that specific need. All right. Let's talk a little bit about getting your best post-COVID IEP. I'm going to take you maybe back to basics a little bit, which is, how do we think about IEPs in general? I think it becomes very overwhelming for families. I'm going to walk you through how I approach it and what I ask families to focus on, and then what advocates can focus on to help support families, or what you can help support yourself or your partner with as you're looking at getting your IEP. And a lot of people don't like this part, but I think it's really important to always take a step back and ask yourself, what's the vision you have for your child? Okay. And it's okay to dream just a little and just think, okay, what's my vision for my child when he's 19 or 21? Just because that sets my world. Different children may have vastly different prognoses, but what's your vision? What do you want your child, given your child's unique skills and unique challenges, be able to do? Then back that down and say, okay, what do I want my child to be able to do 3 years from now? And that's bite size. So you're like, okay, I know where they have to end up. What do I think? Where should they be in 3 years? So they're on that track. And then where are they right this minute? What are our baselines? And this is the key where you start with your present levels of academic and functional performance, that good old PLAF stuff. And you look and you say, where are my child's baselines right now? Now you can see they might be different than they were pre-COVID, but you're starting with a child's baselines in all areas. And that's going to drive where you're going to set goals that are meaningful and measurable. So you're thinking to yourself, all right, here's my child right now. Here's my child's baselines. What is a meaningful and appropriate thing that I can try and focus on for my child in the next year? Sometimes you're going to focus on academics. Sometimes you're going to focus on behavior. Sometimes you're going to focus on both. Sometimes behavior may be most important. And so you're going to have 3 behavior goals and maybe 2 academic goals and call it good, because behavior is so standing in the way of being able to just stay focused on academics. And that may have been exacerbated because of COVID. But you individually think, what are the most important areas that you want to address to move those baselines, to make progress towards getting there, getting to that 3-year goal? So you're in 1 year, I can do these 3 things. Then if those met, I can do these next things. And in 3 years, this is where I'll be. And now you can start actually plotting your trajectory in a meaningful way, rather than having these goals be sort of nebulous and fuzzy. And I guess that's where we're working on how to breed brown bear, which does, maybe it's measurable, but it may not be meaningful to you. So then when we talk about, we've set what our most important things are, and we're talking about specific goals, we want to think about what are specific goals that are meaningful to you. And, a lot of times school districts have kind of like this grab bag of goals that they can reach into and pull out. And they look like, oh, that makes sense. That makes sense. But you know your child better. So I'm going to use an example of a child who was nonverbal, but had a very significant receptive vocabulary. And what the school district was doing was insisting on things like the child should say yes and no before they would go to expanding, like reading vocab. And it wasn't meaningful for the child or the family. So they had to push back and say, actually, what I want my child to be able to do, seeing he's nonverbal, is to be able on his iPad to definitely identify all key body parts that have to do with my child's disability, so that my child, if his tummy hurts, can tell everybody. That's much more important to be able to say, my tummy hurts, than to say, that's a giraffe. So these are the kinds of things you want to be thinking through. After you've set goals, and we're going to talk about what a measurable goal is and what a measurable goal isn't, then you, and we're going to put this back into COVID when we get done, but I just want to give this refresher for you all. Then you think about, what are the services that are going to be needed to meet that goal? This is where it's really critical, because you might have fabulous goals and the school is still saying, well, and we'll give him 15 minutes of speech a week. And you're like, he's supposed to learn all of his diphthongs, his T's, his S's, understand plurals. And you say 15 minutes a week is going to do that? Really? And you can debate it, ask them realistically. Don't be afraid to say that doesn't seem like we're going to meet the goal that we just set. That's why it's really important to set your goals first. Don't start worrying about what services your child is going to get until you set the goal. And then you can forcibly say, we all agree this was a great goal. Now let's really talk realistically about what it's going to take so that my child can meet that goal by the end of the year. And I mean meet it. I don't mean making adequate progress. I've run into many families, and I'm even thinking about, well, I'm not going to say anything, but there are people that I've talked to on this line that know what I'm talking about, which is people say, well, your child didn't regress, so that's meaningful progress. No, it's not. Progress means going forward, right? Progress means getting to the end of the line. So staying where I am all the time, that's not progress, because progress is here. So what I should be seeing is boink, 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 da-da, right? So you need to really push hard to say, are these the appropriate services? And of course, if you don't get the services, they say, yeah, 15 minutes is great. Great. Then you're going to monitor the heck out of your progress reports, and you're going to be back showing them if it didn't work. All right. The other thing I want to focus on is I'm on the second to last bullet there. What will teachers need to make sure your child meets them? A lot of times this is a question that's overlooked. So you've got your teachers, they're well-meaning, but they do not have the supports, background, ability, especially with Prader-Willi, to figure out what to do specifically for your child and really be there. We definitely have all probably seen the idea that my child's in the classroom and today we're going to have a motivator, and if everybody does their homework, you get a cupcake. Great. So we really want to think about what teachers need in terms of supporting them for your child in the classroom. And then finally we get to who's going to provide all these services, related services, sports and accommodation, and where is the best place for them to occur. Let's run back through that really quickly. Services, what are those? That's basically your resource. That's your special education. Related services, what are those? That's your OT, PT, school psych, nurse, etc. Supports, what are those? That could be assistive tech, for example. Accommodations, what are those? That's your fidgets sitting in the front of the room, having extra time, extra breaks. Okay, those are, I want you to break that out because they're 4 separate areas, and sometimes it all becomes a pile of mush to you. There's 4 separate areas that you want to focus on, each of which is going to be needed and thought about in terms of that goal. What, a lot of times school districts start with, let's talk about accommodations. Here's everything we're doing to accommodate your child. Super duper. What does it have to do with my child being able to meet that goal? Let's talk about that after we've talked about the goals. Then let's go back and say, what accommodations does my child need to meet these goals? All right. Okay, one more time. What's in that IEP again? What's most important, right? All right, so in a way, if I looked at you and said all that's important, you're just gonna shoot me. So it is all important, but I want you to focus on the second section here, statement of present levels. That's where you start as a parent, all right? And statement of goals, I want you to think about meaningful goals to you. And then we're going to talk about measuring progress because it has to be measurable in a way that is understandable to you. And I'm not there yet, but thinking about what we talked about, COVID, compensatory, recovery, these things are going to matter. You are going to want a very clear statement of present levels so you know how much has to be recovered or compensed for. You know that you're going to actually, if you're going to include it in your goal, you may actually have a recovery goal that is unrelated to your other goals because it has to do with basically just getting back in the swing of things. It could be a transition goal. It could be an emotional health goal that your child didn't need before the pandemic, but they need now. And then you would go through the same thing. We just talked about supplementary aids, accommodations, all these things. I think the other thing we haven't addressed, but we have to talk a little bit about that is important is the BIP. I'm going to not talk about that today, although it's definitely important. And if you have questions about it at the end, I will address those. But it's probably not going to play a big role in comp ed, recovery, and ESY unless what's happened is your child is now exhibiting additional new behaviors that came directly out of their inability to continue their education in the way that it was before. In that case, it may be appropriate if your child did not have a BIP to create one. And the only thing I want you all to have in your head with regard to BIP, here's what a BIP is not. Johnny will stop doing X. Johnny will have 100% behaviors all the time. That's not a BIP. A BIP is something that works for your child and the school district. So if your child is disrupting and that's not working for the school, but your child is disrupting because they're anxious, they're overwhelmed, they need a break, then an appropriate behavior intervention, this is a behavior intervention plan, is intervening in the behavior with something that works for your child. So what may work for your child is taking a break. Maybe it doesn't work for your child because your child will always try to take breaks. It's individual to each, but I just want to make sure everybody understands that a behavior intervention plan is not a plan to make your child's disability disappear and make them act like every other child that doesn't have a disability. Sometimes school districts think it is. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about goals. I think it's very important. What is a goal? And we're talking about, think about this in terms of your recovery goals or your compensatory ed goals. There's a condition, a time frame, accuracy, and method of measurement. So here's a good example. Given instruction, practice, manipulatives, and a math sheet. Now, why do I start there? Because a lot of times school districts don't talk about what they're going to give your child in order to achieve it. It's really important that each goal starts out with, when we give your child this, then your child will be able to do that in a way that we're going to measure. And here's how we're going to measure it. Okay, so given instruction, practice, and manipulatives, George will be able to solve 2-digit math with and without regrouping. Now we know what we're going to looking for with 80% accuracy 4 out of 5 times. And we're going to collect data monthly. And we're going to review data monthly, and we're going to analyze every single daily math sheet. Now we know the world. We know exactly what they're supposed to do. That's a goal. And now, y'all, pop quiz. I know you love pop quizzes. I can tell. This is the old teacher in me coming out. Is this a good goal? Are these good short-term objectives? You're very fortunate that I can't see you and call on you, or I would. So let's just go through it. And I want you to think to yourself, does this look like a good goal? Does this look like good objectives? If there's something wrong with them, what could it possibly be? So let's say here's the goal proposed. George will improve his reading comprehension skills by using graphic organizers to access the curriculum with 70% accuracy per quarter. Okay, short-term objectives. He'll summarize or bullet important information in a variety of reading material with 70% accuracy. He'll recall specific facts after reading a variety of texts with 70% accuracy. He'll summarize a passage. He'll use vocabulary. All right, I want you guys, I'm going to give you 1 second, and then I'm not going to call on you. You can just decide good, bad, or ugly. What's good, what's bad, what's no good, and why. Go ahead, take a few notes. Just think, if she calls on me, which she can't, so you're safe, what would I say? All right, I'm going to go on to the answer. No, they're garbage. Folks, it was all garbage. Let me tell you why it was garbage. The IEP goal makes no sense. Before you can create any goal, you need to know the present levels. Where's the starting point? Did we have a starting point there? No, we don't know how accurate George reads to begin with. Okay, how do teachers work to improve George's reading comprehension by using graphic organizers? 70% accuracy. What does that look like? So he gets a graphic organizer, okay, and that's going to improve his reading comprehension. How are those two connected? And even if they were connected, how would you and the IEP team know if he improved to 70% accuracy? Accuracy at using graphic organizers, accuracy at reading comprehension. What is it? What if it's 62 or 57? What do these even mean? We don't know where he's going. We don't know what the purpose is. We don't know how it fits in what you want him to be able to do. All right. And how can he summarize with 70% accuracy? How do we know that he didn't summarize to what is 70% accuracy? You can start to see that this is really kind of fluff. I do see that there's a question in the Q&A box. I'm going to let the organizers pop in if they think it's appropriate right now, or I can take it at the end. But whoever put a question in, I can't read it, but I see you're out there. Okay. Behavior goals also should exist if your child needs behavior goals, but understand your child needs to be taught a skill set before they can achieve a behavior goal. So if you have a behavior plan, you ought to be having a specific instruction that is saying, just like I had given math instruction, it's going to be given X, and they're going to have to tell you what they're going to do to actually give you, social stories, modeling, peer interaction. Given these things, your child over time will be able to improve behavior. So the goal should move a child to a functionally equivalent replacement behavior, not just the presence of a desired behavior. In other words, what's a behavior that achieves the same outcome for the student as the problem behavior? That's your magic behavior goal. So I just want to make sure that if your child is having behaviors, you understand what a behavior goal should look like. And if you don't, you might want to research it more or get some additional assistance. I'm going to show you 2 more for behavior. All right. Here's a decreased problem behavior goal. By this date, Sam's episodes will decrease during science and socials as measured by. Great. How's that going to happen? And what's it do for George or Sam? Versus Sam will present his pass card. Okay, that's what we want him to do. That's the replacement behavior. Why? For the purpose of getting out of what is making him crazy, he's going to present his pass card instead of throwing a fit. That's a replacement behavior that's acceptable. It works for Sam or George, right? And it works for the classroom. So, and he's going to do it every time he needs to say a break. Okay, that's when we want to see it. And he'll figure out how to do that and become quiet, and we'll record it. So this is what we want to see happen. I just want everybody to see the difference between these, because I'm going to bet you if you have behavior goals, yours probably look a lot more like the top than they do the bottom. Okay, now let's put it all together. And I've got 7 minutes to do this, and then we're going to go to Q&A. So, questions about the type of services needed. The first thing you want to remember is you want to go back and say, do I need compensatory? Did I just not get anything? What was completely missed? Do I need recovery? Do I need ESY? Do I need summer school? Do I need some combination of the above? Now, I know this is the first time you're seeing summer school. Summer school differs so much from district to district and even school to school across states and countries. The one thing I would say to you is summer school, unless you have a state law that mandates that it gets provided, is the one thing that's really up to the school. They can say, we have it, we don't have it, we have the money, here's who gets it, here's who doesn't, it's our priority. They can't discriminate against you on the basis of disability, but there is no requirement to offer summer school. Many schools, however, are offering summer school because there have been significant amounts of funding coming from the federal government to help with comp ed, recovery service, et cetera. So summer school it can be for everybody, right? It's not just for children who have an IEP or a 504 plan, but your child could participate in summer school as well. And maybe that way it's the least restrictive environment. So your child is in with their general ed peers, but they're getting some of those recovery services and comp ed services along with the summer schooling. So they could come earlier, they could have that added into the summer school day. It's an opportunity to create a structure where your child can access additional services. So don't be afraid to to request how that might look. And again, I don't care what it's called if you're getting the services you need, but these are 4 different avenues by which your child may obtain additional needed services. So again, questions to ask, right? Comp ed, stuff, what was not provided, where's your child now, and what will it take to compensate? Do you want to do minutes or something else? It's comp ed. Recovery. Does your student require a new eval? If so, what type? Do you need a whole new MDT? How will that eval be conducted? What's the impact of that decision? Will your student's IEP reflect the additional recovery services? So do you need new PLAFs? Do you need recovery as part of your goals? Will it be in the specifically designed instruction? What's going to be the frequency? Because remember, comp ed is sort of outside of the IEP. Recovery is an IEP team theme, but you can actually create a section called recovery that is in addition to everything else your child would normally be doing pursuant to their individual education plan. When can you guys all take it? Like, how do I stuff this into my day? What's going to work for me? What's the compromise that works best for me? And will related services need to be increased or adjusted? So in other words, you've already got your IEP. It says you get 30 minutes of this and 20 minutes of that, 15 of this. For recovery, do we need to increase those related services? If so, how? So recovery is sort of the whole, my child just needs more of everything to get back where they were. And do I need to increase some of those services? Questions for ESY. Will my student lose new critical skills without continued support and teaching? Will it take a long time for my kid to regain the skills? Does my kid have difficulty retaining skills? Does my kid need continual reinforcement to keep his skills going? Does my child have behavior issues that get in the way? And was that going to be a problem next year without some continued support over the summer to keep things the same, to keep that a steady regular schedule? Is my child suddenly now back in the saddle making progress? And if we're going to cut it off again, we're going to have that regression. It's going to be a double dip of badness. And has there been, or is there potential for significant regressions that will require significant recoupment? That's sort of the same thing as the top. These are different questions, different ways of asking these. So regression and recoupment are two different words that they sort of play together. Okay, one last thought. What about my child who's aged out? I have an 18-year-old, 19-year-old that, 2020 was their last year and they lost it. And now what about that? And the answer is they still should be able to get compensatory. Now this would be compensatory ed. And recovery is, because it's not in IDEA, I don't know as a lawyer how much I could argue, but I might argue that even recovery service, so in other words, even if they tried, but you couldn't get it. This goes back to what OSERS just said a long time ago, which is there was a finding that because the basis of comp ed is a remedy to the past denial, that remedy should be available even after the right to FAPE is terminated because you still lost it. I hope that makes sense to you. So in other words, this is a little bit of a trickier argument, but if you are in that situation, you may reach out, try to find counsel and obtain additional services. And we are now at 11:59 at Q&A, timely NIC page showing up.
Great. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. This fantastic presentation, great topic, and we definitely have some questions. So we'll start. The first question, if my child goes to a residential school, which school is responsible for paying for the compensatory services? The sending district or the school the child is attending?
Presuming that this is a public school and your child was either placed there or your child got there because you went through due process because you didn't think they got FAPE before, it's the school district, the public school district that is the sending district. So they always retain the obligation. And I know that what school districts do is they say, okay, well, if you're here, here's your IEP, and oops, now we've put you in a third level placement, and that's their program. But the school district still has the obligation, if your child wasn't able to access that program because they were closed because of COVID, it's the school district that has the duty to recompense you. So they need to either buy additional services from that third party, or they need to find other third party services to recompense.
Okay, and the person who asked that question is a private school due process.
Okay, then I'm going to go, it will depend upon your settlement terms. In other words, if you entered into a settlement agreement with regard to that due process that limits the scope of the school's responsibilities, it may be the residential school. It sort of depends on your unique settlement agreement.
Okay, thank you. The next question from the same individual, saw a huge regression in speech during the pandemic and school closure. However, the school is telling them that their daughter's speech has recovered and that they can understand her. However, when I talked to her on the phone, I cannot understand her and have asked her to repeat herself several times, sometimes 5 or 6 times or more. What can be done about that?
Okay, Paige, I'm really sorry. Your voice was pretty fuzzy, and so I'm not quite sure I heard the question. Is there a way I can actually, oh wait, you know what? I think I can actually see the questions.
Okay.
Let's see.
Let me know if you can't see it and I'll try to speak a little bit louder.
Okay, we saw a huge regression during the pandemic. The school is saying speech has, quote, recovered and they can understand the child. But when you talk with your child, you can't understand her. Okay, well, the real question is speech recovered versus where would her speech be if she had received the services she was supposed to be. So in other words, I think those are two different questions. If she is, I don't know what they mean by her speech has recovered. Okay. If she was readily comprehensible before. You should actually be able to see data and measurements. You can actually request for an eval. You could ask for an outside eval to come in and say, you know, let's look at the, you know, your child's eval before. Here's what they were. Here's where they said she was making progress. Here's where she is right now. And now we're going to do it again. So we knew where she was. Let's have an eval. Let's see if that really is recovery. So I would ask for an eval.
Great.
Kate, do you want me?
Can you hear me any better now, Elizabeth, or not?
I can, yes, thank you.
Okay. And since you can see the questions, you can certainly chime in. The next question is, what is the best way to learn and find out about all the benefits and make sure we're not missing anything that we should be offered? This comes from a parent who still has, you know, a child under 3, but just trying to learn and be prepared. Okay, so I'm assuming that your child is on an IFSP. You haven't even moved to the IEP. So the services that are owed are slightly different and they come from a different funding source. But you still need, there is a different remedy for compensatory ed isn't the same under an IFSP. And neither is recovery. Well, I mean, recovery services maybe, because this is a whole brand new thing that basically got made up out of whole cloth due to the pandemic. So what I think I would do in this particular instance, if you're still under an IFSP and what you were supposed to get was A, B, or C, and it didn't happen, I would be calling the provider and asking, how can I recover these services? What additional can you do to help me? Because like I said, comp ed and doesn't apply under IFSP. So you don't have that same appeal and due process rights, but you either may have some state obligations that the state has set, and I don't know what state you're in. If you're in Nebraska, they haven't done it. And you may also be able to simply work through with the provider saying, how can you help me make up for this? So it's more of a conversation at this point. Now, if your child is age 3 and they're just getting into an IEP, in other words, you were on an IFSP, you started your IEP, so it depends on when you started it and what you didn't get. I'm not sure I answered that question. I tried. If you have additional question, you can put it in the chat box, like I missed it. Okay. And I think you did a good job. I mean, an additional question from the same person, and I'm just going to answer it for you. I mean, the question is, you know, I guess she asked, if we don't like our providers, can we change them? Once you're in the school, in the elementary school, that's a little bit harder, but she also asked if, you know, they should be in communication with the IEP team. But yes, your IEP team is everyone, your OT, your speech, your PT, whoever's participating in that IEP team meeting, everybody is on the same page, should be in the same room with, you know, talking at the meetings. So, and if you happen to, you know, not like one of them, you have to definitely talk as an IEP team and work that out with your school. But Elizabeth, you can add to that.
One of the things I would say, I'm sorry, Paige, is what you just said applies to everybody at school. So your OT and PT at school, but it's also if you have private assistance that you're getting, it's very helpful to have them in communication with the IEP team. And in part, twofold. One, sometimes a school district is not as up to snuff as it needs to be, and your outside provider can really help create a stronger goals, stronger objectives, stronger BIP, because they know your child. And also it's important just because they can add to the knowledge base for your child. Okay. So now comes a time where other people need to chime in with your questions. I know there's a lot more participants than the 3 that asked questions. So if you have them, this is free chat from a lawyer. How can you lose? All right, you might be getting a little, maybe somebody's typing, maybe they're not, or maybe you're just shy.
We'll give it another minute or two while we're waiting to see if there are any other questions. Elizabeth, when when you do finally land on something with your school for compensatory education or recovery or whatever, did they need to, I'm assuming they need to provide something to the parent in writing, and then how do they track those hours, or how do you keep track of that to make sure that your child is actually getting, you know, what you agreed upon?
That's a great question, Paige. You know, I think the challenge with if you arrived at compensatory ed through the due process, then it's going to be basically a contractual situation where it's going to be governed by an agreement that is enforceable in court. If you arrived at the compensatory ed through a negotiated agreement with your district where it was basically they don't want to go to due process and why should we go through that, then the real trick is just basically keeping on them. Now, yes, you should put it in writing. Yes, you should have it, and sometimes it's, but remember the compensatory ed in the traditional structure that existed before quote recovery services was, it's not inside the IEP. So it's different because it isn't necessarily an IEP team decision. It's a school district decision. So it's a matter of having it in writing with your school district and asking them, how are you tracking this, and show me that this was provided. So it's a complex matter because it's individual and it's all about how you went about obtaining those services.
Great, thank you.
I see there's a new question. If schools and parents have a settlement agreement, can the parents go back to the table and renegotiate the agreement? Ooh. Generally, the agreement is the agreement, and you would only be I'll call it renegotiating the settlement agreement if something wasn't provided or working out. In other words, I'm going to put like the school district hat on, and let's say that you entered into a settlement agreement and it said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to give you, you know, you're going to go away. You're going to buy your own private education. We don't want to see you. You don't want to see us. You don't like us. Here's $250,000. Bye-bye. Okay. And now you want to change that. The district has no motivation to change that, except that there really is no way for them to prevent you from re-enrolling your child in the public school. And then if they don't get FAPE, starting all over again. The only other way you would renegotiate the settlement agreement is if the settlement agreement's terms themselves permitted it somehow. Because it's a contractual agreement. It's sort of outside of IDA rules. The same person said she lost a year of school. Okay, you know what? I don't know what you mean by that. If she didn't go to school at all, and your settlement agreement says they are going to provide schooling, well, then you've got a breach of contract issue. So. Okay, school's closed. Is this the school that, I'm sorry, it was the private school, or is this a different person? Can't see.
It is the same person. It's a private residential school.
Okay, so honestly, I'm having difficulty answering this question because without seeing your settlement agreement, without understanding exactly what happened. So in other words, if your settlement agreement says, we're going to pay for, you know, what's going to happen is we weren't able to provide your child FAPE. So what we're going to do is we're going to pay a private school, and here's the private school, and you go and we'll continue to pay that school, and we owe you 4 years of schooling, and she didn't get a year of schooling. I don't know that that's a renegotiation of the agreement. I believe it is an enforcement of the agreement. So if they owe you 4 years of school and you're only going to get 3 within this time period, that's a breach of contract issue. And you might want to talk with your counsel that helped you with the negotiated agreement, figure out what happens. You know, generally if there's a breach, you would have to go through the courts to effectuate a remedy to that breach. But you could also reach out to the school district and say, hey, you're in breach. And I know it's a pandemic, but you still owe me a year of school. So this contract doesn't end in 3 years. It ends, you know, we need to relook at it. But I'm going to tell you, it's going to be a legal question and you will need to get legal counsel for that. Okay, we have another bold, intrepid question. When the school district is funding a residential school in another state, At what point can they legally determine the funding is finished? Is this in the contract that I don't remember seeing when the child first was sent to this school? All right. So the answer to this, if I'm understanding the question right, it goes like this. You have a child. The school district determined they couldn't serve your child. They found a place to serve your child and put your child in that setting. And they owe your child education from 0 to 21. And at 21, they age out. So if this is all part of IDEA, which I'm making the assumption it is, and the placement has been there, then it's the funding, if you will, is finished when the child has, when they have met their obligation to provide educational services for your child through the age of 21, unless your child graduates prior to age 21. One of the things that's very critical to understand is we don't want our children graduating because that says that they've got everything that the school can provide. That's why we have all these transition services in our IEPs. Those are not to be overlooked. Part of the reason we have transition services is to make sure that we have goals with regard to becoming a young adult and what those goals are going to be. So your child may need to know, basic things like what, how to read a danger sign and a stop sign and a poison sign, or there's how to use public transportation, how to call 911. These are all things that are goals and objectives, living in the real world, how to do your laundry, how to not burn yourself on the stove, that you're going to set for transition. And even if your child has met their academic goals, they have not yet met their transition goals. So they stay within the IEP process until age 21. And that should apply regardless of setting. So that's okay. Child is 18 plus, is in 5th grade level of education with, okay. But the answer still is that the school district owes your child an education until 21 and the year. So if your child turns 21 in October, they get to keep on going until the end of the school year. But after that, the K-12 or PK-12 system does not owe your child education anymore. Okay. Anonymous. My daughter, age 19, is at a grade 3, grade 4, but somehow passed MCAS at public school. How is this possible? Here's how it's possible. If you really want to go all the way back to the Andrew F standard that I talked about at the very beginning, it is to meet appropriate goals, appropriate in light of your child's circumstances. So there's 2 issues at hand. The first is, I'm sure your child did a series of assessments, and it probably included a WISC or a Wechsler's or something that basically did an overall, for want of a better word, an IQ. And that in some senses, like in other words, could drive that where your child is able to learn versus where your child's learning level is. And so the question is your child making appropriate progress in light of their circumstances? If they should be able to read at a 10th grade level, then they're not making appropriate progress, and that's a FAPE issue. If their entire capacity has been determined that the likelihood, given maybe their processing skills or something else, is that because they process very slowly, they're probably never going to read faster than a 6th grade level, then you may have a very smaller gap rather than a large gap. That the question is, was FAPE provided or not? So it is possible that your child could graduate appropriately while still reading at a lesser level, if that is appropriate in light of your child's circumstances. So it's a very unique question. And the way you answer it is looking at the assessments and looking at what we believe our child should be able to achieve given appropriate supports in light of their very individual circumstances. Last question, isn't it until age 22 in math? You know what? I don't know the answer to that. It very well may be. States do have the right to offer increased mandatory services. It's different, but what IDEA says is until 21. Other states may expand that at their own decision making.
Elizabeth, I have a couple questions that came in directly to me.
Okay.
One of them is, there is a school, the student does have an IEP. She is being homeschooled with a tutor currently. The school wants to socially graduate her. She is not 21. She has not aged out, saying that she made 5% progress this year, although she's still struggling and has not met her goals.
Well, and the question is, what do they mean by social graduation? I just had a child who is 18, and they wanted to reward the child for, this is a child that has very severe behaviors and is in a severe behavior program, but they still wanted to reward the child for all of the effort the child made. So it's sort of like, applause and praise for what you have done, but it won't exit you from the program. So I don't know what they mean by social graduation, but it sounds like that. The key is asking, what do you mean by that? What is the impact on the services you're going to provide for my child? So if it's an, a praise and an opportunity to reward a child for hard work, in terms of letting them walk across a stage, that's no harm. It may be even positive because it may be a reward for your child. But I would research, what do you think you mean by that? What are the consequences of doing it?
I'm getting follow-up texts, and it means for them that it's not necessarily a certificate of completion, but it is an end to all services.
Don't do it.
Perfect.
I'm assuming what it means is, I'm assuming you have an IEP, and if you believe your child has not met the goals for your child and the transition services for your child. Now, it's going to be difficult. I think if you believe that you have weak transition services, and so that says, Elizabeth will be able to spell her name, and that's a transition service. You might want to be calling another IEP meeting and saying, just a minute, my child still needs additional things in order to function in, the young adult world. And I want to revise this IEP so that we have appropriate goals so that my child stays in. So it could be a situation where the school district is got such weak goals that they say, well, we've done everything. And then the answer to that is, well, then we don't have the right goals, and maybe we should be calling an IEP. But I would be very hesitant to basically give up on your right to have your child educated through at least age 21 as required by IDEA.
And she's asking, because that is what they're saying, essentially, is that they feel that she's met the goals in place. They are very weak. And despite calling the IEP, so essentially they want to know what should their next steps be, because the school is saying this is the plan. She will be graduating. Well,
I would call an IEP meeting. I would put in writing that you believe that these transition goals were not appropriate in light of your child's circumstances. I'm using those magic Andrew F. words.
Mm-hmm.
The transition goals were not appropriate in light of what's required by IDEA and in light of my child's circumstances. My child needs additional transition services. Here are the services that have not, here are goals. My child doesn't know a stop sign. My child doesn't know, whatever it is. And what may happen at that point is the school could say, so sad, too bad. In which case you would file due process for a claim of denial of a free appropriate public education, which is a more complicated process. We don't have time to go through what that looks like today, but it's effectively a complaint that you file. And depending on what state you are, there's either 1 or 2 hearing officer levels, and then it goes to court. And what you would be looking for is you would be proving up that this IEP, including the transition services, were completely inadequate and were not designed to provide truly an appropriate public education, because here's what an appropriate transition plan looks like, and you didn't get one. Excellent. But if you're going to go down that route, I would probably look towards getting some assistance going through the due process, because without assistance, you're going to be up against a lawyer, and that's not going to be a fair game.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. 2 more. What do you do if you have agreed to an IEP that included a graduation and a transition plan, and the circumstances have changed and your transition plan placement is no longer an option? Can you go back and request a new IEP and look at that again? Or do you have to follow through with the plan to graduate because you approved and agreed to that IEP?
Are we talking about somebody who's going to be 21 or somebody who's 18?
19.
So what the language that I'm hearing you use sounds to me like they're still providing through age 21. What they're saying is, we're going to have your child go into our young adult program, and we're going to be paying for that program until they're 21. And it sounds like what you're saying is, you thought the program was going to be conducted at X institution, and now X institution is saying, no, I can't. And you're worried about that. Is that correct?
Close, very close. The student, in order to attend a specific disability program at a local college, you have to graduate from the school. And so the family has opted to choose graduation and the young adult program in order to go into this program at the college. But they missed the deadline for admission, and the child was not accepted to that program. But from the school's perspective, they declined the young adult program and agreed to graduation.
Well, rescind, I would just immediately turn around and rescind your, you know, what you probably had to do. I mean, you haven't exited, you haven't graduated. Rescind whatever acceptance you've set and say, I still need services, because they have to provide them. They can't just say no.
Good. And then the last one, I'm so sorry, is my child is struggling with transitions since returning back to in-person schooling. The district is telling me that his behavior is not related to his disability and is unwilling to accommodate with a behavior plan.
Wait a minute. They won't give you a behavior plan?
It looks like they want to follow the same type of suspension and disciplinary actions as any other student, and would not consider a behavior plan because they do not consider it related to his disability.
All right, so what I'm hearing is your child did X. They're having a manifestation determination review. When they get to the review, they're saying it's not his disability, it's something else. And so the student code of conduct is going to apply. This is, I know the answer in Nebraska, but it all depends on your Student Discipline Act, if you will, at the state level. And the reason I say that is, so for example, you should have, okay, IDEA basically says, if you are going to suspend or expel for more than 10 days, you have to have this manifestation. And then if it's not if you determine it's not a manifestation of the disability, you can go ahead and implement the penalties, which is the suspension or expulsion. But you still have a challenge under your student discipline, which is, generally speaking, states say you still have to provide some sort of services. So in other words, I don't know what state you're in, but in Nebraska, if my child is suspended or expelled suspended long-term or expelled, there still has to be a program for that child, and it still has to meet the child's needs under IDEA. So in Nebraska, for example, in a way you got a suspension, but you still have to meet the needs of my child. Do you see what I'm saying? Yes. So I don't know that, I don't know what state you're in. So I guess the question is, how do those two things vary? Pardon? I believe it's Wisconsin. Hey, I was born in Wisconsin, but I don't know their laws. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Elizabeth. One more quick question, just for clarification perspective. On the compensatory services, when you get those and you agree upon them with your school, should they be included into the IEP, or is a separate document fine?
Okay, so I'm going to clarify. Are we talking truly compensatory ed, or are we talking recovery? If you meet with your school and you get it called recovery services and the IE team is engaging in a recovery process, it should be part of the IEP. Compensatory ed really is outside of that framework. I definitely would get it in writing no matter what. But the other thing I've talked about a couple times is, do we really care what we call it? If you can get it into the IEP, great. You know what I mean? The school district might balk and say, well, we're giving you this instead of going through due process because we didn't give you 30 hours of speech, but it's not an IEP issue. We just are going to make up your 30 hours. if they do that, then get it in writing somehow else. But if they're willing to sit down and say, yeah, we didn't even give you any speech for 3 months, and we're going to give you a speech as compensatory ed, but we're going to write it in as additional hours into your IEP, great. The more you can get into your IEP, the better, because that's your contract, right? So if you can get it there, super duper. If you can't, at least try and getting it writing outside of that. So it's going to depend on like who you're working with at your district, what their attitude is like, and whether you're really in an adversarial position where everybody's fighting every word, or whether you're in more of a collaborative position.
Great, thank you. Okay.
We actually we had a half hour's worth of questions. That's terrific. I want to give the participants like a round of applause. Well done.
Yes, absolutely. And I don't see any other questions. So thank you much, Elizabeth, for all of your time today and your expertise. And we will be providing this presentation in the slides after the recording has been completed. And so those who registered but could not attend today will also be able to access this information. So again, just thank you. Thanks for the participants, and thanks to Elizabeth. And I hope everybody has a great weekend, and happy Mother's Day to those mothers out there.
Happy Mother's Day to everyone. Have a great weekend. And thank you so much for having me. I really, really enjoyed it.
Great. Goodbye.
Bye.